Thank you for joining us in this presentation on procurement guidance. This video was produced by the Texas General Land Office's Community Development and Revitalization Program. We'll refer to ourselves as GLO-CDR throughout this presentation. GLO-CDR is the state-designated administrator of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds. We are committed to the long-term recovery of Texas communities and to working with communities to help them rebuild. Part of our commitment includes the prevention of fraud, abuse, and waste. And we also try to ensure that grant funds are spent efficiently. This maximizes the use of project dollars so that those dollars go directly into the community. Given your interest in this presentation, we want to thank you in advance for your commitment as well. The procurement process is complicated. Contains many regulations that may include local, state, and federal guidelines. These must be followed to ensure the delivery of essential government services, which includes housing, infrastructure, and long-term planning. We all have a role to play in disaster recovery, and these procurement requirements must be followed. It's very important that you pay attention, because failure to follow these procurement policies may result in the loss of funding. It could trigger additional audits and even penalties as defined by the regulations governance. The purpose of this video on procurement guidance is to serve as an overview to the regulations. It was developed in July 2017, and it provides information on the new procurement standards in 2 CFR 200. If you have any questions following this presentation, please review the Frequently Asked Questions documentation, which can be found on texasrebuilds.org on the 2015 Floods application page. Or if you wish, you may email us at cdr@glo.texas.gov. The purpose of this presentation is to assist the GLO-CDR subrecipients of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds provided by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's intended to help you comply with federal procurement requirements of 2 CFR 200. These requirements apply immediately to subrecipients for the 2015 and 2016 floods allocations. And these requirements will apply to subrecipients under the Ike, Dolly, and wildfire grants beginning September 1st, 2017. Again, the purpose of this presentation is to help our subrecipients comply with federal procurement requirements and also to help ensure the allowability of eligible program expenses. You really don't want your reimbursements to be denied. Further, this presentation provides general guidance. It does not provide a detailed explanation of the federal requirements. You need to be familiar with 2 CFR 200 beyond this presentation. Please also note that this is not legal advice. GLO-CDR makes no guarantee that adherence to the GLO-CDR Procurement Checklist will result in full reimbursement of eligible expenses. To understand the requirements fully, subrecipients must review the provisions of 2 CFR 200.318 through 326. That's the source of these requirements. It's important to note, anywhere there's a conflict between federal, state, and local laws and regulations regarding procurement, the more stringent law or regulation will apply. GLO-CDR has established that subrecipients follow the procurement methods as outlined in 2 CFR 200.318 through 200.326. This includes the requirement to follow state and local procurement law and policies as described by subparagraph 318A, as well as the additional requirements stated in those sections. Subrecipients must update procurement policies and procedures to correspond with the procurement and contract requirements of those standards before you may engage in any procurement activities. The GLO-CDR Procurement Checklist was recently provided to all potential subrecipients. This checklist must be filled out per the prescribed procurement methodology used for each solicitation. No matter which method you use, you must use the checklist. If you need a copy of this checklist, you can find it on our website, texasrebuilds.org, or by emailing us at cdr@glo.texas.gov. Note that this checklist must be maintained with every procurement file. Here's a sample of what the procurement checklist looks like. This is just a portion of it. You can download the entire checklist from our texasrebuilds.org website. Go into the 2015 Flood Project Applications area and download it from there. Or you may just request it from us. Email us at cdr@glo.texas.gov. Now let's talk about some methods of procurement. There are several different kinds. Remember, however, that if there is a conflict between federal, state, and local laws and regulations, the more stringent law or regulation will apply. That means you need to be familiar not only with federal regulations, but also state and local requirements. First method we'll talk about is called micro-purchase. This is the purchase of supplies or services that are less than or equal to $3,000. For these purposes, subrecipients, that's you, may use simplified acquisition procedures instead of small purchase procedures, which we'll talk about in a minute. In addition, the subrecipient must, to the extent practicable, distribute these purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. What that means is you have to use several suppliers. You can't just give all your business to one supplier. Another method is called the small purchase method. This is the acquisition of supplies or services greater than $3,000, yet less than or equal to $150,000. Small purchase procedures are relatively simple and informal procurement methods for securing services, supplies, or other property. Please note that price or rate quotations must be requested from at least 3 qualified sources. A third method of procurement we can talk about is called the sealed bid method. This includes a formal advertising process. It's used for purchases that are greater than $150,000. This is also the preferred method for construction contracts. Bids are publicly solicited. A firm fixed price contract, either a lump sum or a unit price, is awarded to the responsible bidder, the ones whose bid conforms to the material terms and conditions of the invitation for bids and is also the lowest in price. Competitive proposals, another method of procurement, is used for purchases where conditions for sealed bid are not appropriate. This was the preferred method for the procurement of administrative and professional services. With regards to the competitive method, there are several criteria that you need to pay attention to. First of all, you need to provide adequate documentation. This needs to show how the selection process was carried out and that it was open, fair, uniform, and thorough. You need to be able to prove that the federal and state procurement requirements were met. It's important to note, pay attention, if you don't have proper documentation, some of your costs may be disallowed. That means the local entity will have to pay for them. Now, these records must include, but this isn't an extensive list, some of the following information. It needs to include the rationale for the method of procurement. How did you do it? Why did you do it? It needs to have evaluation and selection criteria, objective, measurable. It needs to have the contractor selection or rejection, so you have to document both, who was selected and those that were rejected. and it needs to include the basis for the cost or the price. You also need to pay attention and note clearly during the procurement process any items included in the bid purchase that are not included in the CDBG-DR contract. Now, regardless of the type of procurement used, the subrecipient must execute a contract to document the work to be completed. That's pretty basic. The contract needs to include the agreed price, the contractor or provider's required compliance with all applicable federal, state, and local requirements that the subrecipient must follow. In other words, the contract needs to state this is what the contract cost, this is the work that will be completed, and this is how the contractor will comply with all the procurement regulations. If you're doing sealed bid or competitive proposal procurement activities, the GLO requires that you provide to us certain documentation. These are the documents you will need to submit to the GLO-CDR. The Procurement Checklist, we talked about that earlier. The RFP or RFQ, whichever you used. The listing of bid proposals and the summary of scoring criteria. The grantee approval of the selected vendor or winning bid, and finally, the contract. There's another method we need to talk about, the non-competitive or sole source proposal. This is procurement through the solicitation of a proposal from only one source. Now, you need to be careful with this, because this method can only be used under special circumstances. This method is applicable for all purchase levels, and it requires that you, the subrecipient, provide notification to GLO-CDR prior to implementation. You need to check with us before you pursue a non-competitive proposal. We've concluded our brief look at procurement methods. Let's talk about some of the laws and regulations that apply to procurement. Some of the state laws and regulations include Chapter 252 of the Local Government Code. One of the things this says is that you have to conduct competitive sealed bid procurement for any and all contracts over $50,000. Again, you can check this out and get all the details from Chapter 252 of the Local Government Code. County subrecipients are generally required to conduct competitive sealed bid procurements for any and all contracts over $50,000 as well. This is covered in Chapter 262 on county grant subrecipients' construction bidding procedures. In addition, the Texas Government Code, Chapter 2253, covers public work performance and payment bonds. That's the bonding requirements for any construction or work that's being done. Continuing our overview of state laws and regulations, there are Texas procurement standards. The Comptroller of Public Accounts has them on their website, the Uniform Grant Management Standards. You can find them on the link. It's on your slide. Conflict of interest is an important topic. We're going to deal with that a little bit in detail later on. However, be aware that regulations can be found in the Texas Government Code, Chapter 573, and the Texas Local Government Code, Chapter 171. Looking now at some federal laws and regulations that pertain to procurement guidance. There are a number of them. Rather than read them all, look at your slide. You do need to look at them. Procurement is an important area. It's one that HUD looks at. So please take a look at the various places where the Federal Register and so on deal with this topic. And remember, as always, that where Texas and federal laws and regulations conflict, the stricter standard takes precedence. Some additional federal laws and regulations concerning conflict of interest. You can see that at 24 CFR 570.489. and 2 CFR 200.318. As you can tell, 2 CFR 200 is a very important section. You need to be familiar with that. There's some additional procurement standards in 24 CFR 570, again 24 CFR 570, and also our friend 2 CFR Part 200. We spoke earlier about the need for documentation. That brings up regulations about record retention. How long do you keep documentation? Basic guideline, records must be retained for 3 years after the state closes the grant. Again, 2 CFR 200.333, 24 CFR 570.490. Finally, there are regulations with respect to procurement guidelines for products containing recovered materials. A lot of recycling, a lot of green going on, so you need to be aware of those regulations as well. That's found in Title 40, Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Part 247. 2 CFR 200, the text, if you wonder where you can read that or find that online, the link there is on your slide. Again, take a look at that and read it. We're going to move now to conflicts of interest. I mentioned earlier that we would explore that a little bit further in detail. Conflicts of interest arise when there's an external interest or an external financial interest or tangible personal benefit from someone considered for a contract. We kind of all understand what conflict of interest is intuitively. Nobody should benefit from a contract except for the people that receive the money in the contract. But it comes up all the time, so you need to do everything you can to avoid, neutralize, or mitigate, reduce actual or potential conflicts of interest. Notice especially the potential conflict of interest. That's very important. Sometimes perception is reality. So pay attention when you're procuring that you avoid any hint of conflict of interest. Continuing to explore the topic of conflicts of interest. On your slide, you can see there are some regulations, Texas Government Code, etc., that address conflicts of interest. You're going to want to look those over, be familiar with them. There are 2 areas especially you have to pay attention to the conflict of interest. The first one is when you prepare your contracts, your bid specifications, draft specifications, so on, statements of work, all the documents that end up going into the bid package that gets advertised. Anyone who's involved in developing those is excluded from bidding on the contract. So they cannot participate in developing the standards and then turn around and bid on the contract. The second area is similar in that anyone who is currently receiving assistance under a CDBG contract award or is required to perform work under that contract, they may not participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract supported by CDBG-DR funding. Again, you want to avoid any hint of someone benefiting from the award of that contract. You may want to think about and choose to broaden conflict of interest to family members, relatives, etc. But certainly for the initial people, you have to consider it. As an example, just maybe this will help clarify things. An administrative consulting firm, you hire them, they develop and distribute the RFP. They cannot then turn around and submit a proposal to that RFP. So pay attention to both of those areas. When you're doing procurement, there are some common mistakes that are made. We want to talk a little bit about those and just point out, hey, pay attention. One is conflict of interest. We just dealt with that. Another one is to make sure that everything is documented and that your procedures and standards of conduct conform to the federal laws and regulations, especially those in 2 CFR 200. Another common issue or problem area is using the wrong method of procurement. So make sure that you use the correct method based on the size and dollar amount and so forth of your contract. Another place where problems can arise or mistakes can be made is to make sure that when you're negotiating profit, you do that in accordance with federal regulations. That's very important. That's something that HUD will look at. Another area with respect to procurement that sometimes mistakes are made, you have to pay attention to it, is in a competitive situation where there's a bid process, so forth. You have to make sure that that is a full and open competition. Guidelines, specific guidelines can be found in 2 CFR 200.319, but several things that it states. First of all is you cannot select based on geographical preference. Now there is an exception to that with respect to Section 3 requirements, which allow for giving a couple points to a low to middle income, low to moderate income business that resides within the area where the work is taking place. Generally speaking, you cannot award based on geographical preference. Another thing you need to pay attention to with respect to this area is that pre-qualified vendor lists, where you choose to pre-qualify those folks, those lists have to be maintained and they have to be current. We've said this before, we'll say it again. Documentation needs to be complete. You need to document everything you do, and you need to be careful about that. If you do it, put it in writing. Finally, understand and make sure that all the requirements that you expect from your bidders are clearly outlined in your bid process. Experience, whatever, all of that needs to be documented before you go out to bid, so that when the bids come in, the proposals come in, those are the factors you use to score and award the contract. Another area in procurement where you need to pay attention, mistakes can be made, is noting that if the contract is in excess of $150,000, you need to perform a cost or price analysis. This has to be done, and it has to be done in accordance with 2 CFR 200.323. Now, the text of that section is in your handouts if you've downloaded this presentation. But in summary, sort of the bullet point version of that, it says three things. First of all, it says that you have to do a cost analysis. We've just said that. How detailed that is and so forth is a little bit dependent on the project and how difficult it is, but at a starting point, you have to at least get independent estimates. Number 2, you need to negotiate profit as a separate element of the price for each contract if there is no price competition, and in every case when cost analysis is performed. What that means is, again, establish a fair and reasonable profit. That's based on difficulty, complexity, risk, experience, so on, but you can't simply pick a profit number out of the air. You have to be able to defend how much profit is built into your contract. Lastly, note that a cost plus a percentage of cost, commonly called a cost plus contract, or a percentage of construction method of contracting, neither one of those is acceptable. You cannot write a contract, a cost plus or a percentage of construction cost contract. You can't procure that way. Finally, a couple of last things to pay attention to when you're doing procurement. Make sure that you avoid any problems or mistakes. In your documentation, make sure that all your applicable contract provisions are included, and that you include that you have a documentation of the history of the procurement, all the steps that you took, in other words, to award that contract. use the man-hour breakdown for determining whether it's grant administration or engineering procurement activity. So you break that down by costing. And then finally, as we've said before, if there's a conflict between federal, state, and local laws and regulations regarding procurement, the more stringent law or regulation will apply. All right, now we want to give you some resources with respect to procurement guidance. There are a lot of them out there. They're listed on your slide. The OMB presentation, the first one listed, it's a 40-minute video. Gives some good insight into what's new about 2 CFR 200. And much of what we've talked about in this video is included there. There's a helpful overview for grantees and some direct links to the CFR procurement standards there on the HUD website. All of these links are active in the PDF download of these slides, which can be found on our website, texasrebuilds.org. Some additional resources for you can be found, great resources on the HUD Exchange website. Not just procurement, but all kinds of CDBG issues and trainings are available there. You want to note that and go there often. Specifically, you can search for procurement and their trainings will pop up in your search box. The last link you should pay attention to, that's the HUD Guide to Cost and Price Analysis. That's a useful resource as well. Another resource that you probably wouldn't think about, but it really is a resource, is the checklist. We talked about that earlier. We showed you a little piece of that, an example of the GLO-CDR procurement checklist. But that's a helpful resource because if you work the checklist, it'll keep you on track and help you answer the questions you need to answer. It has basically 6 sections in total. First one is general standards for procurement. Second one is competition. Third section is method. Fourth is contract price, cost. Fifth is bonding requirements. And the last section, section 6, is contract provisions. So you can find that checklist again. You can download it from our texasrebuilds.org website and go to the 2015-2016 floods applications page, and it's available there. Thank you for taking the time to view this video presentation. The Texas General Land Office also wants to thank you for your time and hard work that you do on behalf of our Texas communities. By following local, state, and federal procurement regulations, you are helping to ensure our communities can maximize their disaster recovery funds for their much-needed long-term recovery projects. We've referenced lots of resources in this presentation, but one resource we haven't mentioned are the hard-working employees of GLO-CDR. We want to be a resource to you, and we encourage you to reach out to us anytime you have a question or a need. We want to ensure that you have the tools you need to succeed. You can visit texasrebuilds.org for more information. Or if you have a question, please email us at cdr@glo.texas.gov. The hard work starts now. You need to take this information and review and enhance your current procurement procedures. Make sure that they reflect the new HUD requirements for CDBG-DR funds. By doing your part, together we can help rebuild Texas and serve those communities that need help the most. Thank you again for all that you do to make the state of Texas a great place.